Hey there. How you doing out there in YouTube land? Um, as I said in the last time I spoke, I had a few of these books that I had finished since the last time I had done a cast. It's probably around the Ayn Rand episode in mid-November. And I was in the middle of another project, and I really wanted to get that done. That project actually was the Federalist Papers. I was recording all those as audiobooks, but I finally finished all those, and I've actually put them out on their own special playlist. Now I can come back and go to the pile of books that I had to decide of books I had finished reading along the way. I'm actually happy I've been finding more and more time to read because it is such a fun hobby of mine. I love it so much. I always encourage people, you just gotta read. Read more. It doesn't make it matter what it is. You're not out there trying to memorize the dictionary or the encyclopedia. You're just getting that knowledge in your head some other way, whether it be telling stories to your kids or reading the comic section of the Sunday Times or something like that. I don't think the Sunday Times has a comic section, but you know what I mean. Just, I'm a big fan of reading. Always encourage other people to do it. There you go. And actually, the majority of my channel is me reading books in audio form to people who might want to be listening to it in a car, in their office, or exercising. And I figured it would be a good idea to also make it here in some kind of book review format to share with you some of the details of these stories. So without further ado, we have another one by Stephen King coming up here, who actually makes an appearance twice within 7 or 8 episodes. So I used to be a huge Stephen King fan in my high school, maybe college days. I have pretty much fallen off of that wagon for a while. But this is another thing I found at a used book sale. Love going to used book sales whenever I can find them. Always stock up on a whole bunch of novels and things, sometimes even gifts I can give other people. But this ends up being a short story collection. And it's called Everything's Eventual. As it washes out and slowly comes into focus. There we go. So 14 dark tales called Everything's Eventual. And this had come out, I'm going to say, over a decade ago. Real quick, looking at a book, which makes for great entertainment. 2002. Wow, 20 years ago. So 2002 is when this was released. And since then, he's obviously, he bangs out a new book every year, something like that. Constantly on bestseller lists. Constantly on, go through the airport, see the bookstore, boom, right in front. Many copies available and many copies bought. But I digress. So, this is one of his typical sized books, too. It's about 450, 460 pages long. However, it is split up between 14 short stories and actually 15 chapters in total. I'm going to give a quick little synopsis right now of all of them and then come back to you with some final thoughts. I will say I am a fan of short stories. I do like them because it has the tendency to just get to the meat of a detail underneath a layer and maybe even more specific that doesn't have to be wasting a bunch of words, world building, and giving you all the different details behind the scenes. The best way I can visualize that is on Netflix. They actually have this anthology series called Love, Death, and Robots. Animated stories, probably about between 8 and 12 a season. And all the animated stories are between 3 and 8 minutes long. So you could knock out a whole season in one sitting if you wanted to. And they do have a story on there called Sunny's Edge, which is my favorite of all of them. I think there's 3 seasons so far. And it takes place in a sci-fi world in a battle royale type of thing where people control monsters and the monsters fight. But it is so deep and down in the weeds that you don't have to know about how the world got there or when is it actually or how do they even find these things. It's a short story. So it's going to give you the prevalent details to get you there to that level of depth as fast as possible, and then they could spend all the meat of the time, all their words, all their minutes on the screen, giving you the actual story. And I think that is something that short stories tend to do very, very well. Is you don't have to know what's the time frame. Hey, if it's a pirate short story, who is it, what country are they from, what year is it, so I know which nations are fighting each other. Sometimes you don't need any of that because it's just having a story about one boy on the boat who swabs the deck. But somehow this whole story comes around it. So, again, fan of short stories. Let me move on. So this thing is, like I said, split up. There's 14 short stories and an introduction. The introduction itself, not very long, which is funny because Stephen King generally is very long, but when he does a short story, he's pretty good. Tell some anecdotes, tell some other little stories. Stephen King's always a big fan himself of talking about his love of writing and about how he tries to get the love of writing in other people and how to become a better writer on top of that. On top of that, in the introduction, there's also some general notes about like maybe where some of these stories came from or how they got selected to be in this anthology series or however it comes around to be, what is actually being sold. He gives it in the introduction. Quick, short, to the point. The stories that are in here, the first is called Autopsy Room 4. Oh, by the way, in each of these stories, he kind of gives you a little bit of a paragraph before and after each story. Some saying the reason why he told it, some saying why it was selected, and some even saying, like, listen, it was originally published over here, but I wanted to add it here for this reason because I think it adds X to the experience of reading this. So in Autopsy Room 4, he does have a little story in that little blurb saying, every writer has to do that story about the I'm alive and awake and I'm on an examination room. It's its own little subgenre. Some might even call it a subtrope. But that's his story for that. As a man is about to have an autopsy made of him, but the thing is, usually you do an autopsy on a dead person. If he's fully alive, but for some reason appears dead, once they do the initial incision, he's dead. There's no coming back from that. So, him trying to get people's attention, saying, I'm not dead. Autopsy Room 4. The next one is The Man in the Black Suit. And this is a typical horror story as seen through a child's eyes. And this little kid is just absolutely frightened because he's literally face to face with the devil. And it happens while he's out fishing. And then there's just what happens. I'm going to do the best I can not to spoil some of these things. I'll try to not spoil all of them, but we'll see how it goes. But that's The Man in the Black Suit. He is a devil come to get the little boy type of story. Third story on the list is All That You Love Will Be Carried Away. This is a short story that takes place at a motel room from a traveling salesman who stops there for the night. One of the things he spends a lot of time on here is that he has, as a hobby, a little notebook with him that he scrawls down every clever thing he ever sees that's in like a bathroom stall wall. All the graffiti. He goes, some of these things are just, clever little limericks. Some are funny little things, but he writes them all down because he's a traveling salesman. He sees them a lot. But as he's talking about this and talking about his life and talking about being a salesman, he's got a revolver with him because he's really contemplating suicide. And as the story goes along, he's like, if I do it, how do I want to do it? How do I want my wife to find out? And by the way, I have a daughter, and who's going to find this book afterwards? Oh my God. So he's really thinking about whether or not he's going to kill himself in that motel room. Next one on the list, The Death of Jack Hamilton. This is a John Dillinger story. I think he gets to that genre every now and again, but he literally tells a little anecdote about John Dillinger, who just had done some kind of heist, but one of his squad actually got shot, and now he's trying to stay ahead of the law while also changing cars along the way. And it talks about how a nice guy John Dillinger actually was. Like, if he would steal your car, he'd let you know where he's going to put it, so you can come back and get it later on. He only wanted to rob banks and get the money. He doesn't want anyone else having problems along the way. There you go. Dillinger story. Next one is a story called In the Death Room. This one's actually very interesting too because it's like a reporter who's in some kind of South American country and he's actually captured or taken to be questioned by the chief magistrate or dictator or however you want to say this oligarchy is down in South America. But he's taken there to be asked questions because they think that he's working with some kind of rebellion or some kind of resistance and that he knows what's going on or where he can find them and yada yada. So they're going to talk to him nicely and then probably just interrogate him. Like torture interrogate him. So he's got to find a way to get out of there and get the comeuppance. Or does he? You know? The one thing is, this story is extremely character driven. He gets into, like, say, the dictator and the wife are there, plus the chief torturer and a guard. Like, he gives you such a visual of these people without giving backstory, but you know all about them in that short story, which is just a great talent. So I really, really enjoyed In the Death Room. Stories continue on. There's one called The Little Sisters of Illyria. Or Illyria. I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce it. But it's a story of Roland from the Dark Tower. He does this pretty often, actually, where he had written the Dark Tower series and he went through books 1 through 7 and then he completed it in his way. He completed the story. But every now and again, the main characters or so show up as a short story somewhere else. He keeps expanding the world a little bit longer, but obviously every time you would read one of those short stories, you know that the events probably don't change the events of the actual 7-book written story. So it's just a side adventure. Maybe once or two of them, they kind of give you more backstory and explanation of something that's mentioned in the main story. But, again, it's a Dark Tower story. Whether you loved it or hate it, you can read this or not read this story to go along with it. Following that, we come to actually the story that the book's written for, Everything's Eventual, which is a phrase that one kid says to his friend all the time, like, hey, everything's eventual. This feels eventual. I'm pretty eventual right now. You'll get into that more in the story. But it's pretty much this lone and loser kid who somehow is chosen by some mega corporation to be an assassin. And the reason why he can be an assassin is actually some kind of gift, some power that he possesses. And the person who hires him actually puts him like alone in an apartment, and every week maid comes in, cleans it up, gives him food, gives him money, and then he's good for another week. And every single week he kind of just does the same thing over and over again. The funny thing about it is the whole reason why he wrote the story he talks about is he had a vision, or he actually saw one day a guy dumping coins down a storm drain. And it's like, why would someone do that? And he wrote that into this little story because at the end of every week, this little loner loser kid had to divest himself of all the money he got for the week. Now, he only got like $70 or $100, that's it. So spending that in a week actually isn't that hard, but he had to make sure he got rid of all the change and not squirrel anything away before the next week started. So that's where that story comes from. Moving on. LT's Theory of Pets. This whole short story is just an anecdote. It's one guy in one little warehouse job telling all his friends this one story that he has. Pretty much, have you ever given someone a pet as a gift? And then he talks about, don't do that. And then a story about him and his wife, or his ex-wife now, and they gave each other pets, and just what came out from that whole thing. So, very entertaining. Following that up is The Road Virus Heads North. Another horror story, this one. So a man picks up this weird painting at a yard sale. And it's this kind of eerie gentleman that's actually behind the wheel of a car, like a Corvette or something like that. I forget exactly the name of it, but we'll call it a Corvette. And he's on the road. He's got shades on or something like that. But then, as this guy is driving home, and he lives a couple states away, he notices whenever he stops for gas or to get some food or whatever else, if he glances at the painting changes some. And it almost looks like it's taking the same route that he's taking home. And then it turns out that wherever this guy stops, a murder occurs that he learns about later on. So it's like, wait a minute, am I being chased by this guy in the painting in my own back seat? And it kind of goes down that route. And of course, it comes to the realization later on when he starts putting this together. He goes, I visited family during my travels on the way home. What's going to happen to them? That is The Road Virus Heads North. Next up, Lunch at the Gotham Cafe. Well, they say divorces can be tough. And story takes place during a lunch meeting in some kind of swank restaurant in the city between the couple that's getting divorced and their attorneys. But it turns out that the maitre d' has other plans for them. And let's say madness ensues, and there are a lot of knives and stabbing that happens in this story. Next story on the list, that feeling that you can only say when it's in French. By the way, that's deja vu. This is almost like one of those Groundhog ordeals, Groundhog Day, perpetual loops, whatever else. It's a couple that goes on a little vacation, and the guy's rich, so they go into a private plane, and they touch down, and they go into like a nice private rental car, and they drive to some weird beach area, but it's very swanky as well. But the whole time this is going on, the wife is like, we're going to turn the corner, and there's going to be a guy on the corner selling melons. And we're going to go down the road, and I'm going to see this other girl skipping rope. And it kind of is like that, but a little bit different. And then as you get to the end and they get to the house, all of a sudden there's some kind of tragic ordeal to one of them. And all of a sudden she wakes up, and then it happens all over again. She said, wait a minute, what is that feeling again? And, you can only say it when it's French. And over again, and every time it ends with some gruesome ending. And it just keeps looping. But it's a short story, so it does end eventually. Getting toward the end now. The next one actually is probably the most famous. It's called 1408. This actually was made very famous because there was a movie starring John Cusack and Samuel L. Jackson where there's a haunted room in a hotel. And since a certain time in the Hotel Dolphins history, there's been like 37 people have died in that room. So they never let it out anymore. Well, the protagonist of this is a writer of horror books, and he actually stays in like spooky graveyards and haunted houses and yada yada. So he did everything he can to make them rent him this room. And this is the experience he goes through from the first second he walks into this haunted hotel room. Obviously, this is a short story, so it has, just a very few pages in here to kind of get to the point. And if you ever went to go see the movie, it's much more drawn out, much more details, much more events actually occur, as long as backstories is also in there as well. Second to last, we're actually in something called Riding the Bullet. This is where there's a man in, say, North Maine learns that his mother's in a hospital suddenly. Now he's got to get back to like Southern Maine to get in the hospital, console her, just be there for her in case things really go bad. Problem is, he's dirt poor. All his money's tied up going to college, with which he's probably trying to leave soon. And his car has a bunch of car problems too. So, naturally, he does his own famous pastime, and he hitchhikes across the state just to be with her. Well, this comes down to the whole conclusion of beware hitchhikers, and beware those that pick up hitchhikers. Finally, we go into a small story called Lucky Quarter. This is a woman who's a service staff, cleans hotel rooms after the guests leave. One of the things they usually do with the guests is they put a little envelope there saying, oh, this is for your gratuity if you feel that your cleaning lady did a really good job. And she gives you a lot of stories of what people leave in there or don't leave in there and what have you. But this one day, she goes in there, opens it up, and it's just a quarter inside. And of course, she's pissed. She got a kid that needs braces, and someone's got to go to school soon, so she needs money. There's a note in there, too, saying, this is a lucky quarter. It's true. Lucky you. And the rest of the story is about how lucky that quarter is. So you can see that over the course of these 14 stories, you get some that are really just bloody and macabre, and some are conversational. It shows an eclectic mix of what this writer can do. And when you read it, not knowing what the next story is going to be, unless you obviously listen to this right here, it could just be a surprise, one after the other after the other. And it's better than going to, like, oh, this is a slasher story, and the next one's a slasher story, and the next one's a slasher story. You get burned out. I remember back in the day, the X-Files TV show had a spin-off called Millennium. I think Lance Hendrickson might have been the main character in that. And one of the things was, I think he was able to psychically, in some fashion, find serial killers. Not to mention being a really smart detective and FBI guy himself. But the problem was, the stories almost ended up being like serial killer after serial killer after serial killer. Now, you can do that and change up how the person kills people or how they find them or whatever else, but after a while, it kind of loses its allure. So, doing the same thing over and over again does have a tendency to make it a little bit stale. And if you're going to read 14 short stories about the same type of slasher or horror thing, you might not get to the end. The 14th story might never be read by you. But then again, this guy's pretty eclectic, so you got 14 kind of unique stories along the way. Like I said, I am a fan of short stories. That's why I picked this up. Again, nice used book sale. Got it for like $1. And digested it, enjoyed it, and here I am telling you about it. So, some people just aren't a fan of Stephen King, though, so if that's the case, don't worry about it. But don't forget, there are some lovely movies out there that came from his stories that you might not even know he did. Things like Road to Perdition, Shawshank Redemption, Stand By Me. They all came from him as well, so he's not just the Cujo, Salem's Lot kind of person. Alright, I think I've run out of things to say about this one, so hope this was helpful. I'm sure you'll probably see Stephen King on this list again sometime, but currently I don't think I have anything of his I haven't read that I own. I'm not going to say things I haven't read of his before, because there's tons I haven't, but things that are on like my top shelf there that I need to get to. Okay. You take care now. Bye-bye.